morning, Warsaw. Today is Saturday, 16 September. It will be sunny with highs of 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:28 a.m. and sunset at 7:05 p.m. We are on the 47th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and I can see a very interesting cartoon is published by the British. But Claire will talk about that later. So what else is happening?
So it's day 47, the 16th of September, 1944. And I've got a story really from overnight, from the night before, going into the early hours of this morning, because, of course, the Warsaw Uprising never stops. It's 24 hours. And it's always good to remember what's happening to individuals down on the streets. So today, Elżbieta Zawadzka, Agent Zoe, who has been working in provisioning food, water, medicines, essentially also her team looking at messengers and so on. They are now being forced out of where their base had been. They're being forced into the southern sector of Warsaw as the fighting shifts across the city. And to do that, obviously it's contested territory. They have to go in a narrow trench that connects the different parts of the city. And they have to wait among huge queues of service women who are waiting to go through. And this is happening at night. But there's still bombardments going on, there's still fighting. And Zoe recorded that she felt the heat rise in the air because the wind, the nighttime wind, is wafting around clouds of smoke and flame from the burning buildings around them. And at one point, several hundred terrified civilians rush towards the trench, and then there's this huge crowd pressing on them. And there's this sense of semi-controlled chaos, really. People are terrified. People are desperate to move to safer sections of the city. But there is a system in place. There's a system of passes. Zoe and her team have a military pass, but nevertheless, they're having to wait most of the night, and they're taking shelter as best they can in a bomb crater from earlier on, pressed up against the barricades around the trench. Priority is, of course, being given to commanders and key liaison officers who are taking urgent messages between the battalions in different parts of the city. And then in the early hours of today, the 16th of September, a group of women, part of the Women's Military Service group, are waved through down this narrow trench, and they're lugging with them a load of equipment, so typewriters and also a whole series of heavy sewing machines. And at this point, the crowd of civilians and Zoe and her team, they just erupt. Zoe said she was absolutely furious at their team's further delay, as if there weren't enough sewing machines in the rest of Warsaw, she said. And when the women sort of realised that actually it is quite ludicrous to be taking huge amounts of these heavy equipment, which slows them down, is slowing the whole of the traffic down. Some of them actually set that equipment down, and some of those sewing machines are angrily kicked aside into some of the barricades. And at this point, Zoe just starts laughing. There's a sense of, I think it's hysteria really on the ground. She said the sky was burning. The sky was red. Buildings around her were collapsing. The bombardment is ongoing. She looks down and there are sewing machines tangled up in the barricade by her feet. People are fainting in the crush, desperately trying to push through to get into this trench. And it's only in the early hours of the 16th that her team is finally let through that morning to start establishing, to see what they can do in the sector still being held by the Home Army, where, of course, there's desperate need for them to supply food and clean water to the fighting front line. So this is the situation on the ground. All of these different actions are taking place. We have the aerial supplies being undertaken, but this is what it feels like on the ground. And this is in an area of relative safety, let's say, if any of Warsaw can be described as safe at this point. But Zoe is leaving an area which is heating up with battle, but moving through a trench to an area that is held by the insurgents. But much of the city, of course, has fallen now. Alina, what's happening in Mokotów?
Let's talk about what's happening in Warsaw at this very, very moment. So the Germans are pretty much advancing pretty fast. We're on the 16th day, so we're on day 47. The insurgents have done pretty well. Usually I start off in the north, but I'm going to start with Mokotów in the south today. So there's about 75% losses on the insurgent side. So the insurgents have to withdraw to Górny Mokotów, which is the northern part of Mokotów, because the southern part is being heavily attacked by the Germans. So they're moving inwards. So if you could imagine Warsaw as this one giant sort of apple, the Germans are eating away at this apple round the edges and just trying to get into the core. And this is what they're doing. So think about Górny Mokotów, so northern part of Mokotów, Śródmieście, the midtown. They're kind of like in the centre of this apple, and this is where they're kind of merging into at the moment. So in Śródmieście, the midtown district, the Germans concentrate very heavy fire, especially from the air and artillery fire, of being heavily concentrated on the district. And then, at the same time this is all happening, soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the 9th Infantry Regiment of the Soviets on the other side of the River Vistula are joining in the fight. They're now jumping in their little pontoons and crossing the River Vistula. So specifically over this night. And the attacks by German troops are just continuously happening. It's like they have an endless supply of weaponry at this moment. They will not allow the insurgents to win. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the citron factory. Now, this factory was originally built as a brewery in 1880, and then in 1930 it was turned into a citron factory. So the founder of Citron came to Warsaw and created a citron factory in Warsaw. It doesn't exist anymore, so there's blocks built on the site at the moment. But on September the 15th, so on this day in the afternoon, the German forces are attacking the district, so they're in Czerniaków still, they're attacking the district from the south, and the citron factory is more or less occupied. Inside the citron factory, there are 162 wounded, 37 of who are seriously injured, and there is no chance that they can evacuate. They just have no chance at all. So after a few hours, the Germans enter, they march out the injured and the civilian population, while the seriously ill are still under the care of several nurses, and they remain on the factory premises. The Germans demolish the operating room, and then the hospital remains on site more or less for another week or so, and it now starts accepting seriously injured and wounded German soldiers, who were then transported later on to a more permanent hospital. A few days later, on the 19th of September, a local German reported to the German doctor, Dr. Willi Schultz, who was managing the hospital at the time, denounced 2 wounded insurgents. What the doctors and nurses managed to do before the Germans enter was get rid of any sort of indication that any of the seriously wounded were insurgents. They cleaned house. But this German personally managed to denounce them to the doctor, so the doctor personally shot them. Then a week later, on September the 26th, the hospital was evacuated to Pruszków, and during the evacuation process, the Germans shoot more or less the rest of the wounded who weren't able to move during the evacuation. And then during the march to the railway station, the Germans pulled out several people being suspected of Jewish origin, and they were taken to the German police barracks and they'd disappeared without a trace. Now, talking about that, I want to talk about Dr. Józef Klinger. He was born in 1906 and he was a Jewish doctor. He trained in Bologna. He was an orthopedic surgeon. In 1939 to 1941, he was in Lvov, or modern-day Lviv, and this was under Soviet occupation at that time period, and he worked in the orthopedic department of one of the main hospitals in Lvov. And then, after the creation of the ghetto in 1941, when the Germans obviously invaded Soviet territory, they created a ghetto, and he was taken to work in the Jewish hospital. Then he was arrested and taken to Janowska camp in the summer of 1942, and a few months later, he managed to escape and made his way to Warsaw. He was given a fake name. He went under Józef Majewski or Józef Przeżyński, and he joined the resistance. He became the main doctor for the Home Army in Warsaw. He would treat wounded Home Army soldiers at his home. He more or less risked his life. I think this man was absolutely incredible. And then, of course, during the Warsaw Uprising, he was a doctor. He had to go and join the fight, so he did. He worked in Górny Czerniaków, where exactly this hospital was in the citron factory. When the uprising broke out, he mobilised local craftsmen, civilians, people who he could direct, who would prepare surgical splints, orthopaedic devices, prosthesis. He was trying to get prepared for the Warsaw Uprising, for the damage that he knew that was coming. And on the 22nd of August, he was appointed the deputy commander of the hospital. And on this day, he was one of the people that managed to get rid of all the traces of the wounded. For any of those who belonged to insurgent units, they removed it, they burnt it. And then he held talks with the Germans just before the hospital is evacuated. And then, of course, during the evacuation of the hospital towards the railway station, he was one of those who was led out of the column together with other people who were suspected of Jewish origin. And like I said, they disappeared without a trace. So we know they were shot. We know they were murdered. And brings us round to my whole spiel and my whole rant about how much influence and how much Jewish doctors and people of Jewish origin who did fight in the Warsaw Uprising and who did so much risked their lives, and especially this doctor. I mean, doctors at this point were working 24 hours a day. They were working with no supplies. They were working with no medication, with no bandages, nothing. And they still managed to make it work. And Dr. Klinger was murdered after everything he went through, after he devoted his life to saving people's lives. Moving on from this incredible person, now the last point that I want to touch on today is the Hollywood cinema on Hoja Street. It was bombed, and there was a German prisoner of war camp. Approximately 104 German prisoners of war were killed, alongside as the whole Home Army camp command, those who were the command of the camp. The surviving prisoners of war were moved a few buildings down on Marszałkowska Street, literally just a stone's throw away. Just to remind you that yes, there were German prisoners of war. They were forced to disarm unexploded bombs. They would build barricades. They were given more of the dangerous roles. They were put to work. But more or less normal standard German prisoners, they just couldn't complain about their fate. They were treated well. They had medical care. They received food rations. And like everybody else, unfortunately, when the food started to run out, it also affected the prisoners of war. The insurgents weren't trying to starve them. It's just there wasn't even enough food for the insurgents. So Philip was alluding to this cartoon that we're going to be talking about. Claire, you're going to kick us off with this one. Tell us, what are we looking at?
Well, just to describe it, first of all, I guess we'll put this picture up somewhere so people can see it. But it's a cartoon from a British magazine called Time and Tide, which was a political and literary criticism periodical, set up actually in the 20s or 30s in support of left-wing and very much feminist causes as well, although by the time of the Second World War, it had moved further to the right along with its editor's views. But it was very well known. It never sold that well. I think it had a circulation of about 14,000 at its peak, but had good writers. C.S. Lewis was among its regular writers. And what this image shows, it's just interesting to consider whether this reflects on public opinion more widely in Britain and among the Western allies. It shows, it's very beautiful. It shows a female embodiment of Poland, hooded a bit like the Grim Reaper, but a comforting death. And she is cradling the body of a handsome young fighter, his neck thrown back, still holding his gun. It's very much a sort of Madonna and child pose. And they are sitting in front of the White Eagle of Poland, rising up behind them. And at the bottom, there's only one word captioning this. It just says Warsaw. So I think this is a comment. This is questioning the amount of dead. Is it worth the sacrifice of the brave Polish Home Army fighters? Alina, what's your take on it?
Do you know what I find really interesting about this cartoon very specifically is that looking at the eagle that's in the background, it doesn't have a crown on it at all. And if you look at the communist period, so to just give a bit of context to some of our listeners, during the communist period, the crown was removed off the eagle. So all the various different monuments and paintings and flags and things like that, the crown was taken off of the eagle. And that is because it is not the Kingdom of Poland. That's what the significance of the crown is. And is this cartoon telling the future a little bit about what is coming? I don't really know. That's the impression I'm getting from this cartoon. A white communist eagle rising from the ruins of Warsaw. Roger, any comments on that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that was reflecting the sort of political inclinations of the artist or of the editor, perhaps, they were showing it as the crownless eagle. I mean, that I think is very significant, and I agree. That's the first thing that struck me looking at it as well. So I'm inclined to agree with that. And whether that's sort of foretelling of the future or of the political allegiances of the artist, we don't know. But it's an interesting aspect.
The other thing to say about it is that it is almost a full-page cartoon. This is not a small thing tucked away. This is a very significant... In fact, I think where it's shown here is edited out of this is in a Polish magazine that is just commenting on the British magazine's views. So what we can say is that Britain is paying attention to the fate of Poland, to the action that's happening at this point.
Yeah, coming back to the Soviets, so there's a note here which is rather interesting in terms of how it portrays the Home Army. It was from a member of the War Council of the 47th Army, So General Korolev talks about the Home Army in the Rising, commanded by General Bohr, and it says, I think most significantly, it echoes that propaganda line that we've talked about already, that was put forward by this messenger, codename Eva, who went to Lublin, you remember, a couple of days ago, and was propagandizing that the rank and file of the AK no longer support their commanders and prefer to cooperate with the communist underground. Well, this report kind of echoes that. And it says, due to the failure of the Rising, so it's already saying that the Rising has failed, the Home Army Command has compromised itself to an incredible extent. And this has caused rank and file members of the AK, so of the Polish underground, to be much more inclined to cooperate with the Polish Communist Party and with the People's Army. So again, it's sort of echoing that propaganda line. And it's interesting, it would be interesting to see what evidence there was of that shift. There would probably have been a few people who would realistically, with all the suffering and the destruction caused and the death and everything else, that they would have been rather, disillusioned by the whole enterprise. I mean, even those that had been enthusiastic at the beginning, after 6 weeks of that, after that sort of slaughter that we've been talking about, I think it's highly likely that people would be disillusioned. But then say what you like about the Poles, but there's a degree of realism about their neighbour to the east. So I don't think even that disillusion doesn't necessarily translate directly into a growing willingness to support, in this case, the communist underground or the Polish Communist Party. So it's an interesting, shall we say, extrapolation. The same day, there's another interesting report which talks about the propaganda efforts in Praga. And if you remember Praga, that sort of the eastern side of the river in Warsaw, which has just been conquered by Red Army troops. And of course, the first thing they do is to plaster up the manifesto of the Polish communist government in waiting. If you remember the Lublin committee that Stalin had set up in Lublin to, prepare to take power in a liberated Poland, in inverted commas. And there's a report of seeing a number of residents of Praga, as we said, newly freed from German rule, standing around and reading that manifesto of the Lublin Poles. And one of them asks another and says, what will happen to the London government? Because, of course, London was still, the legal and constitutional government of occupied Warsaw. This was still via the Polish underground. This was the legal continuity to the Second Republic. So their government was still the government in London. He says, what will happen to the government in London? And the reply that he gets is, well, the London government didn't help us to liberate Warsaw and didn't help us to liberate Poland. Therefore, we don't need it. And apparently that answer caused general satisfaction, the report says. So again, is this the reality on the ground? Is this a little bit of Soviet wishful thinking for the purposes of propaganda? We can't know, but it's interesting that it's been reported in that way.
So we've been quite heavy on the Soviets this episode. We haven't really spoken much about what the Germans are up to. Roger, take us into that. What's happening there?
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting reports actually in the materials there. We're talking about the Bailing armies attempted landing across the Vistula, which we talked about mainly yesterday, but just sort of viewing that from a German perspective. So there's one, the combat diary of the German Ninth Army refers to those landings and says that, and I quote, says, only a few boats crossed to reach the west coast, the west bank of the Vistula, and the attacks in the southern section of the city, it says, did not show much progress. So it sort of, I think it's rather realistic, actually. It's rather sort of showing this as being a relatively small scale operation. There are high losses. It does admit that these operations did cause high losses in German ranks, but essentially they've been beaten back. The diary of Erich von den Bach, you remember the SS commander in Warsaw, he refers to the Bailing armies crossing the river as well. He says, today at dawn at 5:30, the devil's dance began. I was awakened by the attempt of the Bolsheviks to cross the Vistula. The attack was repelled, he said. Later on in that same diary entry, he says, I'm wondering how long it will be possible to hold Warsaw. I hope I have some soldier's luck. Every day endured is a success. So a little bit of self-reflection and perspective there from SS Commander Erich von den Bach.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for episode 47. Please join us tomorrow for episode 48. We are about 2 weeks away from the end of the Warsaw Uprising, and we still have a lot to talk about. So please stay tuned. There will be more losses, more gains, lots more capitulation talks. And obviously, we're going to spend probably a whole episode talking about that last day, the capitulation and the end of the Warsaw Uprising. And then do hold on, because even though it is 63 days, we do have one more day to touch on, and we will talk about the further losses of Warsaw and what happens. And I know those are some of the questions you may have, so we will be answering those.